Oh, your favorite podcast has just downloaded, sir. Hello and welcome to another Fully Charged Show podcast, this time coming from a rooftop in Sydney, Australia. This episode is a bit different. It's a conversation I had with a delightful man I originally met a few years back. His name is Ketan Joshi. He's been working in the renewable energy sector in Australia for a few years, and he knows a thing or two about solar, wind, batteries, wires, posts, and of course, lovely, clean Australian coal. So we were sitting in the shade. It was brutally hot that day, so we benefited from a light breeze, which was very nice. On the same day, a very sad British commentator observed that the snow in the UK proved that over 50,000 scientists from around the world are lying about CO2 levels and climate science. Look out of your window, he tweeted from his upmarket North London home. Where's the global warming now? Sad little man. That day, Adelaide, Australia recorded its highest ever temperature of 48 degrees centigrade or 114.4 degrees Fahrenheit, so you might need to take a slightly wider view than from your own front window. Numpty. Anyway, please forgive the occasional helicopter, ship's horn, leaf blower and general city noises in the background, and here is Ketan Joshi.
The reason I wanted to talk to you was because when we met the first time, we're going now. I'll just
cool.
It's all go. So when we met the first time, you were working for the, I'm going to say Renewable Energy Association, but is that the right title?
Something it's very close. It's like a mishmash of syllables. It's
right.
I was working for the Australian Renewable Energy Agency.
Thank you.
Yeah, which is referred to as ARENA.
Sorry. God,
yes.
Right. So I've heard of. Yeah. Sorry.
And that's a government agency that funds research and development of new technologies in clean tech in Australia.
Right.
Yeah.
But then, because what I've said in a very sort of casual way is, Australia is so good for solar energy because the peak demand in Australia would be in the middle of the day with air conditioning when the sun's at its highest, when you get the most solar.
Yeah.
And I've done the argument that those two energy curves I bet I'm not right. But am I even vaguely close?
You are close.
Right.
Peak demand in Australia is still there's a peak in the morning, a small peak, and then a bigger peak in the afternoon.
Right.
So kind of 4 or 5-ish. Good thing about Australia is that by the time you get to 4 or 5 o'clock, particularly in summer, it is still insanely bright and insanely hot.
Yeah.
So there's still a lot of solar resource available in the afternoon or evening peak in summer. That's a big deal.
It's so painfully obvious that solar will suit a country like Australia. I mean, it doesn't. You don't have to sort of know anything about solar to go. I mean, if you look at this today, and actually, it was interesting because when I arrived yesterday, it was actually very overcast and quite dull.
Yep.
It wasn't as bright as today.
What we're seeing for the first time in Australia, and it's quite nice to watch this happen in real time, is solar technology is there now, right? So people have it on their homes. There are large-scale solar farms popping up, like New South Wales and Victoria, and a few new ones in Queensland, and they're starting to play a role in the grid.
Right. So it's actually measurable in the grid. You can see the impact.
It's a thing, right? Like, so you can actually see like a really decent sliver of solar contribution during. Obviously, it peaks in the middle of the day, but even in the evening, afternoon and evening, there is still a decent chunk of solar still there. And of course, batteries are a big deal in Australia as well. We have this grid that is really long and skinny. And what a long, skinny grid means is that a technology that stores energy is really valuable. Right? Because
if it's storing it locally where it's being used, you've not got to transmit it 600 miles.
Transporting is just such a big deal in Australia. Our population is like this thin sliver that kind of just sits along the coastline in this kind of C shape. I'm not to exclude Western Australia and Tasmania. You're great, but the bulk of the population is kind of in this sort of C curve along the coastline, And it just doesn't, it's not like this centralized blob, or it's not even like this spiderweb mishmash like in the UK.
Yeah.
It's really long and thin. So storage can be used in ways that augments the grid. It's not just people with homes and chucking a battery on their home and appending it to solar. We have this specific grid where storage can be used at a grid level, or even on a large scale level as like a utility, in the same way that you have a power station, to shift load, right? So it can charge up when it's sucking up all the solar, it can charge up when the wind is blowing. You don't necessarily need to have it in people's homes. And the people who build batteries on the grid level will make a pretty decent amount of money. Because the cost of transporting it is really high. So they can actually kind of compete with the cost of saying, well, you know, instead of building this new transmission line out to a solar farm, you could build a battery instead. Yeah.
That's nice of them.
They agree.
Yeah, I can tell there's
totally
enormous support. But, oh, I see. So in fact, if you put a big grid battery next to a substation in the UK, it would have a slightly different role to the way one would have here.
Right. So a new substation connected battery was just activated a few weeks ago in South Australia. Right. And it's operated by Electronet. Electronet is a transmission service provider in South Australia, so they're not like a utility. They're not, running a wind farm.
So you can't buy your electricity in your home from them.
No,
they're not like
they run poles and wires, right? And they care a lot about batteries, because they understand that as an augmentation tool to shore up the grid. It's like this kind of whole new undiscovered thing. And of course, in South Australia in particular, South Australia is at the end of the national electricity market.
Of the big C.
And when you're at the end, you don't have maybe I can export power from up here or down here or go sideways. You've only got one choice, right? It's just only connected into Victoria. So having that reduced set of options is a big deal. And then on top of that, you've got South Australia has a really high penetration of renewables, right? So it's got a lot of large-scale wind, and it's got a huge amount of solar. So currently it's fine, right? There was this whole big thing about South Australia's being devastated by blackouts, and everyone's using candles. That was a total fabrication, right? What the issue is that they forecast into the future, and they say, okay, it's currently at about 50% renewables. So if it reaches maybe like 60, 70, 80% renewables.
So I just want to repeat that. It's currently 50% renewably powered, South Australia.
That's South Australia. It's interconnected into Victoria as well. So it does import a little bit, but even when you take that into account, it's still a pretty decent percentage. I think probably 40-ish%. If you take into account the fact that it's importing electricity from the rest of the grid. So
it's still incredibly high, though.
Still massive. Still massive, right?
But so what happens if it goes up? Sorry, I interrupted, but I didn't realise it was that high already.
There are times when South Australia is higher than 100%.
So it's producing more than it can consume. So then it would export.
It exports the surplus renewables into Victoria, right? And it's fine. Right, like
it works all right.
There's just a bunch of things that they have in South Australia that are really clever tools to manage it, right? So they have really good forecasting. So they forecast wind and solar output because you can forecast wind and you can forecast sunlight. You can forecast cloud cover. And they just use that to say, okay, we'll just plan in advance, and every time there's a dip in wind or solar, we'll make sure that there are other technologies in place to fill that gap, right? The other things they have in place is like a really sort of responsive mix. So there's wind and there's solar, but there's also a lot of gas. Gas is a very responsive technology, right? So it's particularly well suited to wind and solar. The downside is that it's expensive, right?
I just want to also underline the fact that because a lot of people go, we may get to this afterwards, but the base load argument, but the idea that I've really been pushing is clean and cheap, dirty and expensive. And every time I hear anything about it, I go, well, we could use gas, but that's much more expensive, or we could use coal, but that's costed. Or, everything else is. So the big argument is, if you want cheap electricity, you go for renewables. But
as soon as storage starts becoming more of a big deal in South Australia, what it's going to do is it's going to eat into gas's share. Because it's dispatchable, and batteries are even more responsive than gas. Right? So they're a machine. You can flick them on and off. You don't even need to spin them up in the same way that you do a gas turbine. And the big Tesla battery that Elon Musk personally flew over to open it.
He personally made it and installed it. I've read about it. It was
he tinkered away at night, just putting the pieces
together.
There
were no other
people
involved.
I'm thinking of that scene in Iron Man where he sort of personally builds it, whereas in reality it would have been like a team of 20,000 workers all like sweating. Anyway, that's different. That battery was assessed by the grid operator and by ARENA pretty recently, right? And what they found is, and they compared the response of that battery to a fossil fuel power station to very, very, very rapid requested changes in output, right? So they control the frequency on the grid by saying, you, generator, I need you to turn up by 10 megawatts in the next 20 milliseconds, right? That's very, very difficult. And because it's so difficult, it's an expensive service. So it just costs a lot to have a diesel generator that you have. It's got this big spinning motor, and you say, change the rate at which the rotor is spinning, and then that'll change the output very, very rapidly. That's fine. That served the grid well up to date. But what they did was they tested the same functionality on a battery, and it was incredible, right? Like they have a set point, and it's like this line, and they're intentionally changing it quickly to test how well it can respond. And they did it with the fossil fuel power station, and it kind of follows, And they did it with the battery, and you can't physically see the line of the battery.
Because it's exactly as they demand it.
It's just the variations are too small to show on a chart. And so
it can respond effectively in milliseconds. I mean,
it's as responsive as you can visually observe on the freaking chart. Like it's just amazing. And so the whole argument that stability and reliability for the grid have to come from big spinning machines run by
nuclear plants or diesel or gas or whatever.
That is starting to really become a shaky argument, right? Now, the technology is still developing, but it has been really quite astonishing. Like, I was optimistic about the way those technologies, like particularly batteries in South Australia, would go. But I've just been completely blown away
so
by
more
how
than you
well
expected.
it's done.
Right. I mean, that's what everything I've heard, and also that in the economics of it. Because you'd think, I don't know what size is the big battery at the big Tesla battery in terms of capacity. It's
80 megawatt hours or something like that. I can't quite remember.
It's quite
but
big.
it's big.
It's big,
right? So what they've done,
it must have cost millions. I mean, I can't even imagine what the cost.
It was expensive. But what they do with it is part of it is reserved by the government, right? The state government said, we're going to fund this, but you need to provide a service to us. So there's just there's a percentage of its capacity that is used solely for the government's whim, right? The whim is in like, we need to call on you to provide power at certain times, and we need to guarantee that it's there when we need it. The rest can be used to make a profit, right? So if you can imagine that extra chunk, it's sort of operating as its own small battery. You can kind of virtually split it out. And they use that to arbitrage. And arbitrage meaning they consume when it's cheap, and they spit it out when it's expensive. And when you kind of look at that little chunk, it's great. It's fantastic. It's just this little money-making machine because they, and this is the thing about South Australia as well, price can be very low when winds are high and solar power is high. Price is very, very high when demand is high but wind and solar are low. That is because gas plays such a big role in South Australia during those specific instances.
Because that's a really important point. So when electricity is expensive, it's because we're burning gas to produce it.
Precisely. And so you can see. I'll send you maybe one of these charts, but you can see these charts that just you plot the output of gas and you plot the price, and it's just like a completely linear relationship, right? The more gas is contributing to South Australia's grid, the higher the prices. The more wind is contributing to South Australia's grid, the lower the prices.
And where I don't know where the gas comes from that they would burn. I mean, is there a local resource of that, or is that important?
So this is a big issue in Australia at the moment. So
because we've got to get to coal in a minute. Because I know that the coal here is very clean, but we'll get to that in a moment.
So the export and import of gas in Australia is a big deal because we sell a lot of it overseas, right?
All right, so you've got gas resources here.
The people who extract gas in Australia make more money selling it overseas than they do burning it locally. And that means to get it here, it costs a lot of money because a lot of it's just going overseas, right?
I see. So if you do want to buy it here, they're going, well, I can sell it up the road for a load more, so you have to pay me more.
Why would I accept a low price for it?
Yeah.
That is partly why the price of gas has risen so much in the past 5 or 6 years. Right. Cost of electricity has risen in lockstep with the price of gas in Australia, very, very closely, right? Yeah. And when I say lockstep, I don't mean it's a rough kind of thing. It's one of those things in other instances where the two lines are just so overlapped that you can barely tell there's any difference, right? And it's because gas often ends up being the technology in the bid that sets the price. Yeah. It's the last one to fill the gap because it's less flexible. So that's a big deal, right? Yeah. So as soon as some other technology, whatever it ends up being, starts pushing gas out of the mix in the same way that coal has been pushed out in Australia entirely, in South Australia entirely, it's going to be a really big deal, right? Prices will go down really a lot. It's not going to be a small reduction, and it's because prices are currently so heavily inflated by gas's whole situation that it's got going on.
And do you think the general Australian public are aware that their electricity is expensive because of gas, or do you think they're going to buy into I'm sure, as people say, the reason it's expensive is because of those wretched windmills and solar panels?
Well, look, I don't think people buy into that, into the renewables are causing high prices that much, right? There seems to be generally good knowledge that it's not the presence of solar power and wind farms that is making price high. I get the feeling that the largest suspicion in the public is around retailers, right? They kind of look at retailers and something's going on here. You're a little skeezy. They kind of get a little bit suspicious about the companies and the corporations
that they're directly buying power from.
Their margins are high.
I think that's fairly universal.
Yeah,
I think
it's
suspicion.
partly true, right? It's just the companies just make a lot of money.
But I think the fascinating thing I find, which is all over the world, is the complexity of the transition. That you sort of think, we'll just I think probably 10 years ago I thought, we'll just have solar panels everywhere. That's easy. The detail of the complexity of transitioning from burning fossil fuels, from burning coal and gas and oil, and nuclear fuel to not burning anything. It disrupts so many industries, so many powerful lobby groups, so many established places that employ lots of people, that have jobs, that are part of the community. Yeah. It's not just some thing over there. It's absolutely intrinsic to our society, isn't it?
Unfortunately, we live in the era of digital noise. So creating noise to thwart a conversation or a discussion or an attempt to educate the public about something is very, very low cost. It's very easy. Yeah. And I would argue that to some degree, the sort of climate change denial movement in the sort of late 2010s, early this decade, kind of pioneered the whole concept of destroying public understanding of something using technology, using digital technologies. And so in Australia, for instance, we had a carbon pricing mechanism for a year and a bit, which was nice while it lasted. But it coincided with a time when there was massive overinvestment in network infrastructure in Australia. And what happened is that the political parties at the time saw fit to blame the increase in prices on the presence of carbon pricing. Which worked, right? It wasn't something that the public was skeptical about. It's something that the public accepted. They looked at the carbon price, they looked at their electricity bills and went, okay, these two things happened at the same time. My bill's gone up a lot and carbon pricing happened. So get rid of the carbon pricing and I'm sure it'll all be fine. And as you might expect, now bills are way higher.
Way higher than they were, and you got rid of carbon pricing.
So even if you take into account the reduction from carbon pricing, the sort of other components are still way higher. And it's because the root cause was not addressed, right? It was just kind of like this sliver at the top, maybe 5 to 10% of the bills was attributable to carbon pricing. But the increase in bills came from increases in network infrastructure. And then more recently, the increase in bills has come from the changing mix in the energy grid, right? And so that's more gas. There's a slightly more... there's slightly higher reliance on other technologies, and so kind of the bid stack has shifted to higher prices, so wholesale prices higher. And so can you imagine, as a consumer, just trying to understand that.
Yeah.
It hurts your brain.
Yeah.
You're like, I don't understand what a bid stack is. Why are you saying bid stack?
Yes.
I've never heard those words before in my life, you weirdo. Like, it's so painful for people.
Yeah.
So, communication and education and
really important,
talking about this
but then,
stuff.
I mean, I would think also
really
that one of the things that would, certainly it completely shifted my whole understanding of how I consume energy. The fact that I didn't even know I consumed energy.
Yeah.
Like electricity. I didn't even, it never occurred to me. You turn a light on, you put the kettle on.
Yeah.
I don't know, is that consumed, but as soon as I did get solar panels, and particularly when I got a battery, I went, oh, I see. Oh, I can shift. Yeah. Oh, if I do this, really subtle, tiny little changes to the way I live, then my electricity bill goes down. I mean, I'm paying in the summer now in the UK. Even in the UK, I pay single figure monthly amount. So
that's great.
Under
that's
£10 a month with now 3 electric cars.
Yeah.
But I mean, that is the summer. In the winter, it's much higher. But that is the best education process. So I'm assuming because there's such a high level of solar penetration in households that people who've got that go, well, I know why we're paying more because it's because of the gas or whatever. They'll have a better understanding.
A big factor in the way retailers have kind of like kept a lot of. I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but I think it's one of those things where it just kind of they've avoided acting on something because it aligns with their interests. So and people not being aware of electricity.
It's very useful.
Aligns with their interests, right?
Yeah.
Like you turn on a power switch and it just something happens, this weird invisible magic going on. I still don't understand how electricity works.
No,
it's voodoo. It's just it's
that,
weird.
I mean, and that I've tried that. I've tried to understand that.
There's definitely a wizard involved. It's just not. I don't get it. Right?
I swear there are small elves and pixies with anvils underneath, behind the wall of my house. They're doing something.
And so, trying to understand it as a quantity, as an amount that you deal with at the end of a time period, is ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
And so, people get electricity bills, and it's just a number. It's just a dollar sign. They understand money, but they don't understand what a kilowatt hour is. No. And so it's so hard. And so that's a key thing in Australia is trying to get people to reduce electricity bills. I'm sure a lot of people grew up with parents who went around habitually turning light switches off.
Yeah. I still do.
But and that plays some part, but you don't have people you don't talk to people in Australia and have people who went around habitually turning air conditioners off, or turning or displacing the time at which they turned on their washing machine. That is not a cultural thing that happens in Australia, right? You don't displace your consumption to lower time periods. You don't choose not to use a dryer when you can put it outside, things like that. I still rent, and so I've lived in so many places where they don't let you hang your washing out outside, and there are dryers inside,
so
and I'm
crazy.
Just I get so angry.
I mean, this is the home of the Hills hoist. The best invention in the world. I love a good Hills hoist.
But you still get apartment blocks where you're not allowed to hang washing out because it doesn't look nice. And I get so furious about it.
Because that's the other. I mean, I think the other thing we should mention is the current temperatures. For instance, yesterday in Adelaide, 46.9 degrees centigrade. Which I've been in 52. That's the hottest I've ever been, which was outside Alice Springs about this time of year. That is pretty unbearable, and I love the heat, but that was.
Adelaide's
really
just the hottest city in Australia now, and by not right now, but all time. It's just really interesting watching the way it was reported yesterday.
Right.
Because of course. These ratcheting moments where each summer there is a record broken, right?
Yeah.
And what you might think from having a record broken each summer is that maybe there's some sort of increase going on. And the trend over time of temperatures and the things that are causing that trend is something that Australian media is still very nervous about discussing. And it's because they consider talking about the scientific evidence and the pattern of data about what's happening is a political act. Right? They see it as a betrayal of their task as journalists to be apolitical and to not talk about political issues. And it is such a clear. I was just reading the news yesterday, and it was infuriating me, right? Because that incident, that single incident, is something that is part of a cluster of incidents that, taken as a whole, are illustrative of anthropogenic, human-caused climate change in Australia, right?
Yeah.
You can't take it that you can't take that single incident and go, it was only climate change that made this happen.
Yeah.
Of course, it's a mix of factors for every single incident.
Yeah.
But that's not. We don't talk about single incidents ever, right? If you look at, say, the way terrorism is reported in Australia, they won't talk about single incidents on their own. They will talk about clusters, right? So they'll say, there was this particular bombing, and it's part of, this group or this this particular religion or race or whatever. They will contextualize it as part of a broader trend always.
Yeah.
But they won't do that with an incident like
with
high
repeated
temperatures.
incidents of incredible high temperatures. Yeah.
So what you get is like this constant thing of like, it was so hot today, all the records are broken.
Yeah.
And then nothing happens, and the next summer, oh my God, it was so hot today, all the records were broken. And it's like, it's just never, you have to ask, like, at what point? Adelaide's records yesterday weren't minor, right? Like it wasn't like, it just kind of like, peaked over by 0.1 of a degree.
Right.
It was in very many places across South Australia that the temperature records were broken. It was a big leap upwards, right?
Yeah.
So the question is then, at what point will media outlets start educating and contextualizing the pattern of what is happening to the atmospheric system that sustains human life in Australia? Because it is starting to reach a point, and many would argue that it has already reached a point where human life is at enough of a risk that it needs to be part of the way it's talked about and understood culturally and in media and in politics. And it is really frustrating to see. So that just came to mind immediately. And then, of course, if you watched any of the news reports, sort of this morning, yesterday, there's always discussion about the power system.
Right.
How
it always links in. Yeah.
And of course, there's this poetic circularity about it, right? Because there are times when people will talk about the power system in the media as being compromised by efforts to decarbonize.
Right.
When at the same time, the reason that they're talking about the power system is that it is abnormally hot.
Yes.
And it is abnormally hot because we have injected these
huge
things into the atmosphere which trap heat and make it hotter.
Yeah.
And so, but it's like this perfect circle, and people talk about these things in pure isolation.
Right.
And as soon as you start linking them, there's this kind of nervousness and this frustration, even among people who would tacitly agree with the ideology or the philosophy of climate action.
Right.
They get really nervous about it. They're like, I don't really think we should be politicizing
it's really
this.
hard
And it's
thing
not,
to...
it's like, a child dies of measles because in a very low vaccination area.
Right.
That will be reported as linked to the low vaccinations in that area, right? Because context and science and evidence matter when it comes to something as important as children's health and vaccination.
Yeah. And that's not seen as a political statement saying that.
No. So the real challenge at the moment is like not just depoliticizing the issue, it's starting to get better in terms of like depoliticization.
Yeah.
But then having the follow-on where people start understanding it culturally and socially, not as a political issue, but as a raw physical, scientific, and technological one.
Oh well, we've got to quickly talk about coal, but then the government, because the reaction to it, the fact that it must be such a strange place to be. I'll try and shorten down my statement so that you can respond to. But it must be such a strange place to be that you're funded discreetly by a coal mining company. You're a politician. You can go and see. And you can see the statistics that generating electricity using renewables is cheaper and cleaner and has less impact on the world. Yeah. But you're still going to stand up in Parliament and hold a lump of coal and go, "It's clean. Why are you so scared of it, mate?"
There are a few moments that I think will stick in my memory for the rest of my life. I'm sure there's other stuff that was lost down the memory hole, faded into the grey matter in my brain. But that specific moment, so
Yeah, who was the politician who held up the coal?
So Scott Morrison, who's our current Prime Minister.
Right. Oh, it was him who held up the coal.
Yes, he is the one who stood in Parliament, and it was quite an amazing scene.
Yeah.
Right? So what happened is he stood up and it was just like order of business, blah blah blah, whatever. No one was really paying that much attention. He's holding a piece of paper, and he just approaches the microphone, and he just whips away the piece of paper, and says, "This is coal," and he holds up this massive fat chunk of coal, right? "This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't worry. This is coal." And he's proffering at the opposition, like, "Why are you so scared of coal?
Yeah.
You shouldn't be scared of it. Look at it. It's fine. It's here." As he was talking and going on about all their talking points, it got passed around like high school show and tell. So I'll send you the clip, if you want to overlay it.
No, I have seen it.
Yeah. And people are kind of like in the background, like looking at it, going,
"Oh, isn't it lovely?"
Passing it around. Now, something a lot of people don't know about that is, first of all, that chunk of coal was provided by the Minerals Council, which is the core lobby group for coal in Australia, right? So he didn't just find it, right? That was provided by the lobby group, which is quite a beautifully sinister little element to that tale. On top of that, you can't hold coal. It's dangerous, right? That chunk of coal had to be lacquered very heavily.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Had to be lacquered very heavily.
So it's not. So you're not getting all the. Well, there's a lot of chemicals in coal, and a lot of other.
Which makes the phrase "this is coal, don't be afraid" extra poetic, right?
The fact that it was lacquered coal.
Because it had to be made safe for him to hold the damn thing.
Wow.
And so that piece of imagery of him, just kind of like just holding it up. Will go down in history, right?
But at the moment, is it possible to generate a megawatt hour of electricity from a wind turbine or a solar farm cheaper than it is to generate a megawatt burning coal?
You can't really do it any other way. Those power stations, those coal power stations, are getting so old that maintenance is now very, very expensive, right?
And they go offline for a long time when they're being...
As we saw yesterday, the grid operator actually had to call on extra reserves because two very large coal-fired power stations in Victoria were either partly or wholly offline for maintenance. Now, the fact that they couldn't choose to defer that maintenance, they would have known well in advance that those days are going to be insanely hot, right? Super profit time for those companies, right? So if they can defer maintenance, they absolutely will, and they couldn't, which suggests that those power stations just have no choice. They have to. They're
on their last legs.
They really are on their last legs, and those shutdowns are going to start happening. There've already been a few high-profile shutdowns of coal. Those shutdowns are going to keep happening. Now, the argument from the right-wing conservative side is that we need to stop those shutdowns. We need to kind of plug them into life support, right? And these power stations are just like,
well, literally everything
rust.
about them, the technology is dated now.
They are
going to be
super old. Hazelwood closed pretty recently, right? Hazelwood is the dirtiest power station in Australia. Was the dirtiest power station in Australia. Very, very big. In Victoria, in the Latrobe Valley. Simon Holmes would be pretty knowledgeable about it. He'll be able to tell you a lot about it. That power station actually coincidentally was at the site of a very serious fire, coal fire, which burned for days and days and days and days. Hazelwood fire. The local town was impacted by the smoke from it.
Of course,
so that power station shut down, and there was just like so much media coverage of it, and of course it changed the profile of price in Victoria, right? So when that coal-fired power station shut down, the things that fill the bid stack are gas at the top of the bid stack because it's expensive, and wind and solar at the bottom of the bid stack because it's so cheap that they bid in at zero, right? So if you think about what's happening, right? Wind and solar are there at the bottom and they're pushing everything up. There's stuff in the middle, there's like hydro, some other power stations, there's a few, there's existing coal in Victoria, and then there's gas at the top. So what happens is price ends up slightly higher after the shutdown of a big coal-fired power station because of what slots into the gap. So what a lot of people looked at in that situation, they saw Hazelwood shut down and they were like, price went up,
Right.
Therefore, we shouldn't have shut Hazelwood down.
Right.
Rather than saying Hazelwood shut down and price went up, what we should do is fill in the gap with cheaper stuff, so that when the price gets set, it's set at a lower cost, right? So they weren't saying, let's replace it with the cheapest, newest technology we have. They were saying, no, we shouldn't be shutting down coal-fired power stations. Right. So the argument kind of ends up in a bit of a circle, because they'll say, well, Hazelwood shut down and price went up, therefore Hazelwood should be staying on. And the same argument is playing out with every single coal shutdown in Australia, right? And it's become like this ideological crutch for specific politicians who feel this panic and this anxiousness at the shutdown of coal-fired power stations, because it's like, this is probably a little, psychoanalyzing, but I like to indulge sometimes, but it's like they can see parts of themselves shutting down.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
There's a really kind of primal bond with it.
Like these old power stations, and they're just
crumbling.
Everyone hates them, and they're shutting down, and the world's moving on, and it's like they identify with that. They're like, that's me.
But there's also, there's also
I'm
big
that power station.
but there's also big economic. The recent decision by the Indian government to not build, I don't remember how many, 12 or 14 new huge coal plants, which were going to be powered by Australian coal to a large extent. They're not going to do it because solar's cheaper. They're doing solar instead. But that's got to have, the exports of coal from Australia has got to be, that's being affected. China's the same. It will be buying less. Everyone knows it doesn't matter what your politics are, that in 20 years' time we'll be burning less coal in the world. Whatever else happens, we'll be doing less of that. It's on its way out, whatever you say.
I think a lot about how we'll look back on this time.
If you explain, I just think if you explain to like your daughter's child, let's jump that generation, and she'll say, Mum, did they really dig stuff up out of the ground, put it on a train, drive the train 4,000 miles across Australia to a place where they burnt it to boil some water? Is that really what? And then the water drove a steam thing, and that made. Why did they do that, Mum? She will be baffled beyond belief. I think the same one goes for Granddad. Did you really sit in a car that had a big block of metal in front, in which there were loads of explosions?
It's ludicrous.
That produced poisonous gas that came out the back.
Insane. So look, I won't be forgiven by my daughter, and by my own daughter's children, for being a member of the generation that did this, right? And I'm a millennial, right?
And you've done more to change it than anyone my generation or most.
I sort of see myself as like, we're the plucky, young, but really, we won't be seen as the plucky young heroes. We will be part of the problem. And to some degree, rightly so. Collectively, not me personally or my family or my friends.
But our generation,
but collectively,
my generation in particular, I think.
So, and I've kind of come to terms with that. And so, it's sort of coming to terms also with how much I can do on a personal level, on a advocacy level, on a career level. But at the same time, I think about somebody else who doesn't have the behaviors or skills to do heaps. They just want to live their life, right? They want to be an accountant, and they're like, this is my dream. I want to be an accountant, but I also don't want to be part of this massive global geophysical evil thing that's happening. And so I think about culpability, and I think about ethics, and it's really hard to kind of understand how collective guilt is going to work in the future. I kind of obsess over it, but it's it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, right?
I think my thing has always been, and this is from personal experience to then expanded out sort of culturally, is that guilt's never worked for me. If I feel guilty about that I've done something that I feel guilty about, I go and do it again. It doesn't stop me doing it. And that's my worry, is that guilt isn't a good it isn't a good motivator. And in a way you've got to have an alternative. We go, I could do that, and I'd really love doing it, and it's really sexy or naughty, but actually this is actually better, and it's cheaper, and it saves me money, and I live longer, and I feel better in myself because I'm doing this thing rather than that thing. I think probably a better motivator.
I agree.
Is that stuff that is, and that's what's, in a sense, I think we're both trying to communicate that notion.
We think about the resolution of problems in binary sometimes, right?
Yeah.
It's fixed or it's not fixed.
Yeah.
But look at South Australia, right? Like it just wind farms in South Australia are sometimes generating a lot, sometimes they're not generating much at all. Now, when you look at their output over the past 5 years, they have displaced an enormous quantity of stuff that otherwise would have come from fossil fuels.
Would have been burnt.
That's a hard number, right?
Yeah.
That is a solid number that you can bank.
Yeah.
You can say wind farms did that over a really long period of time, and they did it without causing any problems at all, right? Yeah. They integrated into the network, they were managed, well controlled, forecasted, dispatched, it all worked.
Yeah.
And that is just a totally amazing story that we, in Australia in particular, tend to forget sometimes, right?
Same in the UK with offshore wind, because people just don't know, particularly there, because you don't see it.
Yeah.
Unless you actually live on the coast and you get up somewhere high and you can just about see some in the distance.
Yeah.
But we're regularly 20 to 25% of all the electricity in the UK. Massive demand is from wind. And people don't know that.
Well, I try and tell people, like, you paid for this, right?
Yeah.
There's a subsidy scheme in place that incentivizes their construction and their continued output, right? It's small, like it's a small fraction of people's electricity bills, but they did it.
Right.
That's your money went to those reductions, and that whatever percentage change in the future, part of it was you already, and you didn't even think about it. It's amazing. Yeah. And so think about what could happen if you did think about it, and you made these tiny little changes. So incremental advantages and incremental reductions in emissions are a big deal to me.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that you shouldn't take the approach that it should all happen pretty quickly, right? It should.
It's also, I think
well.
the feeling I'm getting as well, which is a sort of generalised feeling, is the understanding, that it is, as you rightly said, things like batteries, still developing technology. But when you look at the cost reduction of solar panels, for instance, or as we're experiencing in the UK, the cost reduction of installing and running offshore wind doesn't need subsidies anymore. It's highly profitable and it's much cheaper than any other way you can generate electricity, and it's much more reliable. That's the other thing that I've only learned recently, is that a wind turbine will be operating for longer periods of time than a coal burning power plant, because they have to be serviced and they're offline for a month or 2 months. Wind turbine, there's a bloke goes up and he fixes something and comes back down. It's still a big thing, but it's not. It might be offline for a few hours. That's what it. It's a very different prospect.
As soon as you get really big batteries that are affixed to these renewable energy power stations, and they become one unit.
Yes. Which is, everything is aiming in that direction.
Things are going to be really. It's going to be a huge deal. I'm very excited for that. It may not be for a while, but it's.
So on the whole, then, with your knowledge and understanding of this, this is a very loaded question, but are you mildly optimistic about the future as opposed to horrendously, suicidally pessimistic?
I'm weirdly more optimistic than I was when I was working in the renewable energy industry directly.
Right.
And I find that really strange. I've never quite understood it, and I think part of it is because I had a lot of exposure to the technological side.
Yeah.
And it always felt like the technology was being stymied by politics and culture.
Yeah.
Since then, I've had a lot more exposure to the political and cultural side.
Right.
And a lot of the problems that exist are eminently resolvable.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
there's been a general increase in.
There's been a big increase in public support. There's a big
so.
reduction in sort of things like people rejecting climate science.
Yeah.
And on top of that, a lot of the sort of roadblocks that exist are now sort of on borrowed time, for instance, right? Yeah. So with the Liberal Party, for instance, in Australia, the current government.
Yeah. And it's important to point out to people in the UK who may not know about Australian politics, because in the UK, the Liberal Party are the most centrist. I mean, they're tiny, and everybody ignores them, but they're not a right-wing party. But here, the Liberal Party is a right-wing conservative party. Yeah.
So they used to be explicitly against climate action and pointedly trying to chop down climate policies.
Right.
The current government is just on borrowed time.
Yeah.
All they find that they can do is say nothing about it at all, because that's all the public space allows them to do.
So they've worked out, if they talk about it, they're going to lose votes, which is very interesting. I mean, that's the only reason they would do that.
They are jammed into this tiny little narrow spot, and they cannot move.
Right.
And they're being suffocated. It's like they don't have a climate policy, they don't have an energy policy. They tried briefly, there's a whole story about that, which I won't get into, but It failed.
And you've got, when have you got a general election coming up? Next year, is it?
Sometime.
Oh no, this year.
Probably April or May.
Right.
I think, but
it'll be worth watching to see what happens.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for your time, Ketan. It's really good to see you. And
good to be
thank
here.
you very much for going through all that with us. Amazing. My brain's now overflowing with data. I've got very limited storage capacity.
I have even more charts to send you. Sorry.
Brilliant. Send me all the charts. I want to see charts.
Yeah, awesome.
Well, I hope that was interesting. Ketan is certainly a very knowledgeable man, and I'd like to thank him once again for taking the time to talk to us on Fully Charged. That's all for now. Please do subscribe to the Fully Charged Show podcast. Obviously, if you've never seen Fully Charged Show on YouTube and Facebook, please do go and search for it. It's quite easy to find. It clearly is working. We've just passed 50 million views on YouTube, which is pretty astounding, really. So please do check all those things out. We also are supported very generously by many thousands of Patreon supporters on patreon.com/fullychargedshow. So have a look at that if you want to, and as always, if you have been, thank you for listening.